Good evening. So just to be sure that my name is pronounced properly, it's Dabesaki Mac-Ikemenjima. I think I heard a Geneva from the MC. It's not a... so I guess in a sense, self-introduction is always challenging because you never know what to include. But my career started in... so I started working in an NGO in Nigeria for a long time, and really staying on the advocacy side, talking about the types of roles that young people can play in different segments of Nigeria's development process, education, health, and economic development being like the three kind of big pillars of the work that we were doing. And then along the line, I got into policy consulting, really kind of working with regional institutions around designing some of the kind of more Pan-African policy frameworks. So there was some conversation earlier today about the African Youth Charter. It was one of the things that I was involved in the early stages of my career, helping to work with the African Union to design the charter. And then at some point in my career, I also did some kind of policy research, helping in some countries to kind of look at how well are the public policies in those countries relating to young people being implemented. So in Swaziland, for example, I was involved in a 2-year stretch of research looking at key pieces of public policies that have some implications for youth in Swaziland.
And now you find yourself at the Ford Foundation in Lagos, heading up their work in youth and learning. And as a program officer, coming from the policy side and the research side, you now have a different perspective. You have a dual perspective. In your mind, what have you been able to synthesize as the key factors for being successful as an NGO tackling very entrenched issues?
So, just to kind of provide some background to the work of the Ford Foundation office in Lagos, we work in 3 main areas. We work on political participation as one piece of the work, and the other piece is looking at fiscal justice, kind of focused on extractives and related issues around illicit financial flows and corruption. And then the third piece is looking at education to employment transitions for young people in the region. And we work primarily in Nigeria, Ghana, and Senegal. So just to kind of provide overall background. I think what I found interesting about the work that we do now in West Africa is that we're looking at the heart of some of the most challenging issues in the region. So when you think about education to employment transition, I think there's been a lot of conversations here today about how do we make sure that education is responsive to the demands of the labor market. It almost seems like you have separate audiences, right? So you have this kind of audience where academics, NGO people, people from philanthropy are really talking about what kinds of roles can evidence play in framing education policies in order to make sure that they're more kind of responsive to both the needs of young people and the needs of the market. And then on the other hand, you have government people and a lot of the kind of the policy design. So I think we talked about this earlier where I was saying to you that policy design is essentially informed on the one hand by a more kind of idealistic way of thinking that, this is what the world could look like if we did X. And some of it is driven by some understanding of the data and the research, but a lot of it is just there. And I think in some sense that the connection is not always made between this kind of audience and the people on the policy side. And so being at the Ford Foundation now and kind of looking at both sides of the conversation, one of the things that I found interesting is Ford tries to make the connection between both sides by looking at how can you help to leverage resources on the government side by helping them to be more engaged with the evidence and the data around what works to support young people in a more meaningful way. So I know we would talk about the work that we're doing with PIN, but just to kind of get into it straight away, we had started some conversation with the Niger Delta Development Commission, just looking at the scale of resources that they put into skills development annually. And they had said the challenge that they face is that they're not able to transition these young people from those training programs to jobs. And these are young people who go through programs across a spectrum, from local skills development programs to international scholarships in higher education institutions abroad. Many of them were not able to transition to work. And so we said, well, why don't we all pause for a minute and think about, first of all, looking at the market and trying to understand where are the demands for skills right now, and where might the demands for skills be in the next 5 or 10 years, in order to help us to think about what would be the most strategic way to invest. So in a sense, I'm saying that I think being at the Ford Foundation offers me the chance to be part of the conversation on the both sides, and hopefully, it allows some space to be able to take pieces of the evidence that comes from conversations like this and from research institutions to help governments to think more strategically and invest the funds that they have in helping more young people to transition in a more meaningful way.
And when skills building organizations are not ready to equip the workforce properly, or in another case, when the market is not ready to welcome those graduates into the upstream, obviously PIN is kind of created an ecosystem to address that, to have a collaborative process for that, and not to be locked away into siloed stakeholders. Are you finding that to be one of the more innovative solutions for talking this out and informing those that actually care and matter?
Let me see if I understand your question properly. So I guess there are a couple of dimensions. So first is the absorptive capacity of the market, right? So, in the Niger Delta, where PIN works, they commissioned a study early in the year, and one of the things that came out was in the three sectors, the three main sectors where they were focused: construction, ICTs, and agri. They found that the absorptive capacity of the private sector in the places where the study was carried out was limited. So in a sense, even if they were able to train, for the right kinds of skills, etc., there were not enough places for those young people to be able to be accommodated in the market. And so what they started to think about was, can we create alternative pathways for young people by looking not just at wage employment, but also looking at self-employment as a pathway for youth, and kind of looking at beyond a specific program to provide them with technical skills. Can we also accommodate some training around, business-related skills to support them, assuming that they wanted to pursue this pathway? So I think that's kind of one way to respond to your question. The other way to respond is to say, what if the market is not ready? What if the market is not there? I think in a sense, there are two ways to look at it. The first is to look at policies. What are the projections that are being made about the future? So if the government, for example, says that we want to build a railway, that goes from point X to X, that for me kind of points in the direction of where the jobs might come from, going forward. If the government comes with a 5-year, 10-year plan, and I know there are a couple of countries around, the region, particularly in Southern Africa, that have national development plans that span, long periods of time. The question is always, where do those plans point to? What do they say about what the future of large-scale investments might be in those places, and could those be the places to look in terms of training for the future? And then the last thing that I would say is just, understanding the growth projections of companies and seeing where do companies want to expand to in a particular place. And so doing work with PIN in the Niger Delta, I think the question that they had gone around to ask companies is, where are you looking at expanding to in the next couple of years? And if we were to help to train people for those areas in which you're looking at expanding to, could those be people that you would like to absorb into your company?
That's very helpful, thank you. And then lastly, you've kind of brought up the intersection of sustainability long-term plans, multi-year plans. In the kind of global philanthropic rubric, it's really about impact, measurement, and evaluation. And if there's anything you can share regarding sustainability, particular in relation to Chevron's support, you have a CSR investment into PEEND. You have Ford as an institutional funder. You're looking at a macro, massive issue, and you want to attract more partners, even through an FDI lens. What's the best way to put their best foot forward to have a broad-based stance for success?
Yeah, so I see that we have to end, but just to say quickly that the way that we started to think about this program was really about leverage, and I think I talked about this a little bit. Governments will always spend money on skills development training in places. In Nigeria, it's a long, history of investing in skills development training for young people. They call different names: skills acquisition programs, investment in technical schools through the education sector. So there would always be investments in skills development training. I think the question would be, and the question that we had at the start was, how can we ensure that we're more helpful in the ways in which these resources are expended by demonstrating what works? So in a sense, for the long term, there are two things that we're thinking about. One is looking at demonstrating what works and documenting that for the purpose of learning, kind of putting it out there. And then the second bit is working with entities locally outside of government, to look at how can CSR money be channeled towards more structured, strategic programs that help to meet a defined need. So PEEND is supported by Chevron as it's a CSR program, right? So all of PEEND's contribution to this work primarily comes from the oil industry. And so we've said to PEEND, can we convene a donor conference comprised of actors in the oil industry who would all come together and have some conversation about whether it's possible to channel some of their own, CSR resources into a pool for, the next 5 years, so to speak, to invest in the places where they work. So this could be, in the Niger Delta, which is obviously where the large portion of Nigeria's oil and gas resources are located. But it could also be elsewhere in the country where these companies have an interest. So we're talking with PEEND about, organizing some donor conference towards the end of the year where we would have that conversation. And I realize that because all of these companies are in the oil industry, there might be competition in terms of who wants to get more visibility for their contribution in this way. And so those are things that I guess we would kind of need to figure out in terms of thinking about finding a way for all of these actors to collaborate. Just the last thing to say is that for this project that PEEND is working on, they've taken an ecosystems approach. So basically they have representation from the private sector, representation from government, from regulatory bodies, from training institutions, and young people who all sit on an advisory committee and kind of think together about what makes the most sense, in terms of identifying training institutions, identifying employers with whom they can work to find a way to absorb the young people whom they train from this process. So there's serious thinking about sustainability because, obviously Ford's resources are finite and there's only a certain amount of time within which we can support.
Thank you. I think we can open up for Q&A.
So my question is both to the panelists and a little bit to the audience in terms of the appetite and acceptability towards what is the definition of sustainable finance and what exactly is happening already. Because if you look at the US model, a lot of it is also alumni donations, it's industry donations, it's working with companies, it's working with the private sector. A big part of university financing in Africa is significantly public investment. And that should stay, if not increase. However, if we're looking at our current enrollment rates, we're at about 8-9% average in sub-Saharan Africa, outside of South Africa, global average is approximately 28%. How do we get to that accessibility level? And you look at Latin America, evidence shows that Brazil was able to increase its access for a lot of the young people through private institutions as well. So how do we make that, what are the pathways towards increasing quality and relevant access and the financing questions around it? So some of the things that we're engaged in is towards obviously performance-based contracting, so that the existing funding that is going in is showing specific impact and results. But also, given where we are, this is one of the big questions that we think about. Thanks.
Thanks for your question. I think I would just stay within the limits of the conversation now. We can talk a little bit more about sustainable financing if that's something that interests you. But just in terms of sustainability for the work that we're doing with PIN, and I know I've been saying PIN without actually saying who PIN is. PIN is Foundation for Partnership Initiatives in the Niger Delta. It's an NGO that was set up by Chevron as a way to kind of invest its corporate social responsibility investments in communities in the Niger Delta. The Niger Delta is a part of Nigeria that is comprised of 9 states. I think it's useful to provide that background. And those states are kind of the main states where Nigeria's oil and gas resources are located. So to have that background. So to respond to your question, I think for us, when we went into this process, what we wanted to achieve was to have some demonstration of what a meaningful workforce development program would look like for the Niger Delta, with the intention that we would be able to leverage more resources from state governments and from federal institutions working in the region. So if we were successful, then we would be able to develop a model that state governments could use in their work in the long term. So if we were successful in doing that, I would think that, sustainability is built into the way that the program was thought about and designed. I'll leave it at that. And I talked a little bit about raising more money going forward to continue to support the project, assuming that that's the thing that PIN wants to do. But obviously, the broader conversation about sustainable financing, I think that's something that we can do.
Thank you so much, Brian. On peut les applaudir. Give him a round of applause for this exchange. Thank you, Dabesaki.